All right, so we're going to cover chapter 14, module 14.1, personality theories. We're going to go through this quickly, and I'm going to give you the highlights instead of a full lecture. All right, so personality is an elusive concept. It's this kind of idea of what makes you you and the person next to you them. There's some grand personality theories, ideas that cover almost everything. Then there's some other ones that just kind of talk about personality types. Some of the things you may have heard of is anal retentive, obsessive compulsive, and there's a lot of associated behaviors with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine kind of personality, the challenges around personality, and also some of the great thinkers, right? And so we're going to start with Freud. We're going to talk about a little bit about humanistic, Carl Rogers, and we're going to talk about behavior theory of how we see personality. Personality comes from the Latin word persona, which means mask, and how we're going to define it in this class is basically the consistent ways in which your behavior differs from others in social contexts. Remember, when we're talking about individual behaviors, when we're talking about human interaction, there's always a social context, right? What's rewarded in one context might be punished in another, right? And so some aspects of your personality in some contexts would be treasured, and in other parts it might be met with some kind of punitive issues. All right, we start with these kind of four areas of personality, right? Hobbes was a great English philosopher. He wrote the book The Leviathan, and he basically thinks that all humans are selfish and that government is needed to protect us from our baser natures. On the opposite side of philosophy, there's Rousseau, and he believes that all humans are good. He's French. He comes with the idea of the noble savage, that if we could just free ourselves from civilization, from corruption, we would just have a natural paradise. And then we find in psychology, we find these two diametrically opposing ideas, with Freud believing that our natural impulses are detrimental to society and we create all sorts of ways to control ourselves. And then Carl Rogers, who's a humanistic, he believes that people are good, noble, and then if we could just deal with some of our hangups, we would be, most of us would do just fine. All right, so when we talk about Freud, Sigmund Freud is a Viennese psychologist, and he developed the psychodynamic theory, and he relates personality to this interplay of conflicting forces inside the personality, inside that person. So there's things like your fear of death, aggression, your desire for sexual intercourse, things like that. And the person may not be aware of this, and so he's one of the first people who starts talking about unconscious and conscious thought. So Freud's theory is super important to 20th century psychology. His influence is now waning. Not a lot of strict Freudians out there anymore, because it's very difficult to test empirically, right? If everything's happening in the subconscious, then it's hard to see what's going on. Many psychologists, especially clinical psychologists, no longer regarded as useful, though some of his basic ideas are still used among mental health practitioners. All right, so Freud, his main influence was a psychiatrist named Joseph Breuer. Joseph encouraged patients to recall early traumatic life experiences, and he believed by going through this early childhood traumatic experiences and bring them up to the light, they would relieve some of their physical symptoms. And the associations that are kept with them. During this time, that pent-up release of tension was called catharsis, the kind of cleansing, right? And Freud's idea was he developed a method that explained personality based on the interplay of your internal conscious and unconscious forces, right? Your unspoken desires and how you interact with the world, and he called it psychoanalysis. So in Freud's thought, he has the unconscious mind, and your unconscious mind holds your memories, your emotions, your thoughts, right? Irrational and socially unacceptable ones, right? And they influence our behavior, right? And psychoanalysis try to bring out these unspoken, unconscious thoughts, bring them up, and so we receive catharsis. And we're going to talk a little bit of some of the ways that they do that as we move forward. All right, so one of the things Freud noticed is that a lot of his early clients had early trauma, right, what we would call adverse childhood experiences. And so at first he developed some theories to explain excessive anxiety, right, what we now call, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, depression, things like that. And so he originally talked about things here. He was very focused on sex. So he talked about the lack of sexual gratification, traumatic sexual experiences from early childhood, right? Because it's kind of the Victorian times. He's hyper focused on sex. One of the things we do know now moving forward would be that the traumatic sexual experiences from early childhood will create problems going downstream as you get older, right? Freud is one of these people also. He stands by hypotheses. He makes them not very based on science. So he came up with things like the Freudian slip, right? And so he conducted some evidence for sexual abuse from dreams, slips of the tongue, other indirect signs, not actual reporting, which is what we would be looking for right now. Um, and Freud was big on the idea that he was the expert. And so even if a client said no, that never happened, Freud would insist that he knew better than the client, right? Then this is a common trend for Freud. Freud realizes that he is wrong and just automatically doesn't. He says that he was misled by clients. Um, there's no way that he could have made a mistake, right? It's usually somebody else. And this is a pattern you're going to see with Freud if you study him moving forward. Right? He comes up with the Oedipus complex. This is the idea that is based on the story of Oedipus Rex, which some of you may be familiar with. And this is an idea that you have this unconscious desire to have a relationship with the opposite sex parent, realize it's forbidden, and this creates these challenges. What we tend to see with challenges between, young males and their fathers, and young females and their mothers, right? Like many things Freud came up with, it's a lot of good theory, not a lot of evidence to support it. And Freud was a huge fan of not really looking between results and evidence. Not good scientific practitioner. So Freud develops a psychosexual framework of development, right? It's a progression of complex about what he calls sexual energy at the time, right? And he believes that this kind of your personality goes through certain stages due to where you are in life. Certain parts of your life you receive this pleasure from different physical sensations, right? And so he covers, and he says this kind of being managing this developmental influence really affects you downstream, right? He also talks about libido, right? He uses this for innate psychosexual energy, not the idea that we use it now in how interested you are in sex at the time, right? And he talks about this libido, this energy is gratified by different things over a lifespan. There's 5 stages, right? And he talks about if your normal development is blocked, if you don't move through all the stages, you become fixed, and you look to gratify that libido, that life energy, in a way typical of earlier periods. So the first part is he talks about oral fixations or oral stage, right? First year of life, where most individuals are interacting through the world through their mouth. So this is breastfeeding. This is putting things in your mouth. This is how babies explore the world. And if you get stuck in this stage, you're going to have problematic eating, drinking, substance use and abuse, dependence on, or independence from others. So this is kind of that Freudian hedge. We're going to cover everything. Right? About ages 1 to 3, this is when potty training generally starts, right? He talks about this intense pleasure derived from stimulation of the anal sphincter. If you get stuck in the anal fixation stage, right, people are either incredibly stingy, very orderly, or messy, or disorderly. And you hear that, sometimes we even hear that in common parlance where somebody says, hey, stop being so anal, right? Stop being so detail-oriented. All right, phallic stage comes from this idea of derived from stimulation of the genitals. Phallic fixation involves this kind of fear of being castrated in boys, or penis envy in girls, and they wish they were boys, which we know is kind of, the evidence doesn't support that one either. Right. Then from about 6 years to middle school, right, to about adolescence, no real psychosexual interest, plays mostly with same-sex peers. Though there's a lot of evidence that show this is cultural artifact from these kind of developed nations that we have, because non-industrial societies don't experience a latency period. There's not this, it's kind of, they mix, they match, they all work, they all play together. Then adolescence and beyond, if you make it there, you're not fixed on this, right? You go to what Freud considers you have a healthy sexual interest in other people, right? If you get through all your stages, you're going to have sexual intercourse will be your main way of fulfilling that libido. But if you've stuck in an earlier period, it's hard for you to move forward. All right, super hard to test. Not a lot of research has been done, and there's really no evidence that problems originate in difficulties in particular stages. Someone who has substance use disorder may or may not have had the appropriate amount, or may not be stuck in an oral stage, is probably better explained a lot by adverse childhood experiences, or, as we talked about before, right, activity in the nucleus accumbens. All right. One of the other things that Freud adds to our idea of personality, he talks about the id, the ego, the superego. Right? Inside these are these warring factions, right? The id is about I want it now. The superego is how do I get it? Not really thinking about morals. I apologize. The id is I want it now, right? Instant gratification. The ego is how do I make sure, how do I get this happening without any kind of morals? And the superego has a moral compass to it, right? They warn each other, right? We're always thinking about, hey, I want this. If you think about it in the playground, hey, I want this lollipop. Little kid goes, I want lollipop. Ego says, well, I can take it from little Johnny if teacher's not looking, right? Superego says it's wrong, and they struggle. It's not there's no real part of the brain, no structure that says id, ego, superego, but it is metaphorical, and we can use it to kind of pretty much conceptualize a lot of our psychological distress. All right, I'm going to skip through these. All right, so Freud's structure of personality, they usually act as healthy ways, right? We're going to talk about some of the things that we can talk about, his techniques for dealing with your unconscious worries, right? And some of them are healthy, some of them are not, right? Denial, we're going to talk about things like denial could be unhealthy, it could be healthy. All it depends on how the effect is in the environment. So some things he talks about is rationalizations, right? Making up excuses, repression, right? Forgetting things, right? Regression, returning back to juvenile behavior. Denial is the refusal to acknowledge a problem, right? Or we talk about displacement, diversion of unacceptable thoughts and impulses to true targets to less threatening ones. The idea of it rolls downhill. And then reaction formation is this idea that showing thoughts and feelings extremely opposite of one's true ones. Right? Sublimation would be channeling these energies into acceptable or pro-social behaviors. This is the idea that if somebody really, really likes the idea of smashing people and hurting them, instead of becoming a thug, they become a contact sport. They join a contact sport where they're praised for it. It's socially acceptable. And projection is that idea that you see the worst, right, aspects of yourself in other people. So we'll flip through these. These you can figure out. The answers are right there. All right, so one of the things to think about with Freud is his legacy. His evidence is pretty weak, right? We talked about if we want to be an evidence-based practitioner or evidence-based consumer, Freud doesn't bring a lot to the table. And one of the things we have to remember is Freud was one of the first people that said, I can take somebody who's suffering, have them sit across from me, hear their problems, and help them, right? It's also one of the things is we're not sure because he had so many people following him and he just threw so many things off the cuff. We're not sure how many of his theories he actually created and how many are just attributed to him. All right. We do know this, mental humans have a mental life that is partly unconscious. We're not always 100% aware of why we do things, right? We often have conflicting motives, right? I'm scared to meet people, but I don't want to be alone, that kind of stuff. And then we do know childhood experiences really contribute to adult personality and social behavior, right? We can see this through the lens of learning theory. We can see this through the lens of psychodynamics. Right. We also have some ideas that we know relationship in our family of origin influence those we have throughout life, right? How we interact with those first people in our lives or how we interact with others. Here's some other people that we're going to talk about. Karen Horney was one of Freud's, she's a female student of Freud. She said he over-exaggerated sexuality and also misunderstood women's motivation and the dynamics of family relationships, which makes sense because in those days, fathers were not as involved in the child's relation, in the day-to-day routine of the family. Carl Jung is one of Freud's golden boys. Jung emphasized this idea that we had a collective unconscious, using some of the ideas of folklore where there are always some standard characters, trickster characters, wise maiden, the wise man, the maiden, the crone. He proposed this idea that we have a collective unconsciousness that connects all human beings. Alfred Adler also quarreled with Freud, and he created an idea of individual psychology, right, where he looks at the person as a whole instead of this partitioned idea of just your unconscious desires that Freud went with. Right? Adler believes that we seek personal excellence, right? We strive for superiority. And we have a style of life. We have a plan to have that superiority. And people who fail suffer from inferiority complex because they feel inadequate. They're not living the style of life that they wish. Right? Adler also looks, hey, if you're looking for superiority, you should be concerned about others, right? Inside that individual psychology is a kind of a social psychology piece. He talks about how healthy individuals will have a sense of belonging and identification with others, which we know, right? The more healthy you are, the more joined in community you'll be. We know that isolation, which is funny enough for right now, isolation can lead to increased mental health issues, right? And so he talks about psychopathology involves setting inadequate goals, faulty style of life, and lack of social interest. Now, we wouldn't be able to talk about personality without talking about learning, right? Behaviorism, the operant conditioning. Some psychologists are pretty skeptical about personality in general. And they believe that most of it, we have behavioral styles depending on social context. And we talked about this before, right? The way you are going to act in class is not the way you're going to act at out on a Thursday night with your friends is not the way you're going to act at church, right? One set of behaviors is exhibited at work, school, at home, another with friends. And even inside that friend group, you're going to have different personalities. So the learning approach kind of says specific behaviors to specific experiences, right? You know how to act at school, right? You know how to act at church, and also how we're treated by others, how we're reinforced or punished by our environment. Really affects our personality. One of the things we talk about in learning approach is the gender role, right? There's a psychological aspects of male and femaleness, right? And so when we look cross-culturally, we realize that some of these aspects are just learned. Certain things that we consider specifically male or female behavior in Western cultures may not be the same in a different culture. Right? And a lot of the things that we have right now is we're either reinforced or punished for acting what we consider appropriate gender roles depending on your cultural background. And then most children imitate adults of the same sex, which is kind of like we talked about social learning theory with Bandura, right? You can see yourself in your parent of the same sex, and so that's who you model yourself after. All right. Humanistic psychology deals with values, beliefs. It's kind of a reaction to Freud. It kind of looks at what people believe and how they perceive and understand the world is what your personality looks like. Right, humanists see us as essentially good, right? Behaviorism is very neutral. There's no good or bad. It's just reinforcers. And psychoanalysts takes a negative view of basic personality. The framework Humanistic gets rid of this deterministic, reductive behaviors. It kind of doesn't look at cause and effect. It looks at the person as a whole. And humanists are looking for peak experience. Instead of why is your life a complete train wreck, let's look at the good things that are happening. Let's look at the greatest points of human beings. Instead of looking at psychopathology, they look at positive, positive and almost humdrum day to day. Research is usually qualitative, which means it's a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of case studies, right? Recording narratives and asking people why they did something and how they behaved. So Carl Rogers he was trained as a Freudian, and then he had a reaction saying, this is not the way I want to look at the world. So he believed that humans are good, and most of us strive to be self-actualized, right? Reaching our full potential, whatever that may be. And this is the driving force of Rogers' model, that most of us are trying to be the best we can, right? We're doing the best we can. And when our view of ourselves and our view of who we want to be isn't equal, then we have psychological distress. Right? So we have a self-concept, who we are, and then who we would like to be. And if these things don't match up, right? If I believe I'm not a winner, but I really want to be a winner, I'm going to struggle with that, right? And so we have to kind of put those two pieces together, kind of like a Venn diagram, where more covers, where our actualized self is more like our ideal self. One of the big things that Carl Rogers brings to the table that a lot of other people did not is Carl Rogers brings this whole idea of unconditional positive regard. Right? He's famous with I'm okay, you're okay. Right? Because he believes most of our acceptance requires some sort of conditions, right? I like you because you are a good student, right? Your friends like you because you're funny. And he believes that we should just accept people for who they are. And one of the things he talks about is kind of fits on that biblical idea of hate the sin, love the sinner. Right? Also in humanistic psychology is Abraham Maslow, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he creates this hierarchy of needs, which we're going to look at right now. First thing is, your physiological things: air, water, food, shelter, sex. Then you want safety and security, love and belongingness, self-esteem. And then once you reach self-esteem, right, then you are going to work towards self-actualization. Okay. When Maslow comes up with the idea of self-actualization, he looks for these things: the ability to perceive reality accurately, independence, creativity, treating others with unconditional positive regard, a problem-solving outlook, a good sense of humor. Not super scientific, right? A lot of Maslow's stuff was he had a bunch of people that he really admired, and then he made a list of what he admired about them and pretty much came up with the idea of self-actualization. Right? So here are some of the things that we get out of this. Personality theory raises fascinating questions, right? Super hard to answer. And most of the time, researchers can only work on small facets of these questions, right? Things like aggressiveness, things like openness to new experience. It's very hard to do the grand picture. So we're hoping one day we'll synthesize a big picture of who we really are and how to measure personality. All right. Thanks a lot.